Knitting is defined as the intermeshing of yarn into loops to form fabric. The manner in which yarn is fed to the knitting elements during the knitting cycle determines the type of system that is being used. Today there are two basic types of knitting systems, weft and warp. What makes them different? Let's take a closer look at each one. Weft knitting is accomplished by loops formed in a horizontal manner by adjacent needles. It uses one continuous yarn to form courses or rows of loops across a fabric. The most common machine used for weft knitting is the circular knitting machine. This machine creates a tube of fabric in a spiral configuration around a cylinder. The number of needles on the machine, the stitch length, and the yarn size determine the width of the fabric. One revolution of the machine completes one course for each yarn fed. A second type of machine can be used to produce a weft knit. This machine produces fabric on needle beds that are flat, resulting in its common name, the flatbed or V-bed machine. As in circular weft knitting, the width of the fabric is also determined by the number of needles being used, the stitch length, and the yarn size. Regardless of the type of machine used, in weft knitting, needles are placed adjacent to each other and knit in sequence to produce one course or row of loops from the same yarn. Here is an illustration of how loops of yarn are formed on a flatbed weft knitting machine. The loops are being formed from the same yarn in a horizontal manner. Different colored or types of yarn can be used to create design effects and patterns. If the structure is analyzed, a pattern of loops arranged in rows and columns is seen. The horizontal row of loops produced by adjacent needles during the same knitting cycle is known as a course. The course count is the number of courses per linear unit of length, expressed as inches or centimeters. If this drawing represents a 1-inch vertical distance, then there are 5 courses per inch. Each vertical column of loops produced by the same needle knitting at successive knitting cycles is referred to as a wale. The wale count is measured by the number of wales per unit of width. If this drawing represents a width of 1 inch, then there are 5 wales per inch. Weft knitted stitches are formed the same on both circular and flat knitting machines. This illustration on the left shows flatbed knitting, where the yarns are knit horizontally from left to right. At the end of the first course, the yarn is reversed, knitting horizontally from right to left. The cycle is repeated to form the fabric. The illustration on the right shows circular weft knitting, where the yarns always knit in the same direction. The second system used for knitting is known as warp knitting. These machines are designed differently in that they form the knitted loops from yarn in a vertical direction. This illustration shows how warp knitting, in contrast to weft knitting, is accomplished. Looking closely at the illustration of a warp knit, it can be seen that the yarn is intermeshed vertically over 2 adjacent wales. These warp yarns are fed vertically and parallel to the direction of the fabric formation. The yarns are supplied to the knitting needles from a warp beam. The yarns are wound onto the beam from packages into a creel. The yarns arranged in this manner must be placed parallel to each other and under the same tension. Normally, for the most basic of warp-knitted fabrics, each yarn needs its own needle. For example, if 1,000 needles are used on this machine, there needs to be a minimum of 1,000 warp yarns. If more than one yarn is provided for each needle, more elaborate fabrics can be produced. These individual needles knit simultaneously across the width of the machine. Warp knit fabrics have a flatter, closer, less elastic structure than most weft knits and are most often run-resistant. The most common warp-knitted fabrics are tricot, Rachelle, and crochet. Tricot warp knits are made on 2 or more beams of yarn. They are typically fine fabrics with ribs running vertically on the face and horizontally on the back. The tricot knitting machine is used to make light fabrics, normally weighing less than 4 ounces per square yard. Rachelle fabrics are typically coarser than tricot and can be made in a great variety of patterns with multiple yarns. Coarser yarns are used in Rachelle knitting. In crochet knitting, intricate patterns are knit with a wide range of yarn textures. Typical of these are laces and nettings. Unlike tricot and Rachelle, crochet can be made directly from a creel, bypassing warping. The 3 types of needles are the bearded spring needles, the more common latch needle, and the compound needle. Bearded needles are made from very fine wire and produce fine fabrics. The latch needle is composed of a curved hook, a latch or tumbler that swings on a rivet just below the hook, and the stem or butt, and the compound needle where the latch slides open and closed rather than swinging closed. In weft knitting, there are 3 basic stitches. They are the knit, tuck, and miss. Knit stitches are often referred to as jersey stitches, and miss stitches are often called float stitches. In sweater knitting, these same stitches can be manipulated for desired design or functional aspects. These altered effects include transfer stitches and split stitches. The knitting cycle consists of 5 needle positions. They are rest, clearing, yarn receiving, knockover, and stitch formation. A knit stitch is produced when a needle receives a new loop and knocks over the old loop that is held from a previous knitting cycle. For single jersey, this is repeated on every needle at every yarn feed. The tuck stitch is composed of a held loop and 1 or more tuck loops. Tuck loops are formed when the knitting needle receives a new yarn without casting off the old loop. When compared to an all-jersey fabric, adding tuck stitches will result in a fabric that is wider, thicker, less extensible, and has an open or cellular appearance. Also, the tucks will yield more length and less width shrinkage. A miss or float stitch is created when the yarn is fed in the knitting cycle and the needle is not selected to receive it. Thus, the yarn floats to the technical back of the fabric and misses on the technical face of the fabric. Float stitches cause the fabric to be narrower, thinner, and much less extensible. As mentioned, the basic stitches can be manipulated for desired effects. 2 commonly used effects are the transfer and split stitches. These stitches, along with needle bed racking, are used to create special effects like cables, garment shaping, and full fashion. Transfer stitches are used to fashion or shape a fabric panel. The 2 most common transfer stitches in sweater knitting are to either transfer from a needle in one bed to a needle in another bed, or to transfer between 2 adjacent needles in the same bed. If the stitch is transferred between beds, it is called rib transfer. In this illustration, the red loop has been transferred from the back bed to the front bed. After transfer and during subsequent knitting cycles, a new yarn can be added. The transfer stitch will result in an opening in the fabric. Widening or narrowing of a fabric panel or garment can be achieved by the transferring of a stitch or the dropping of a stitch. A split stitch is formed as a stitch is transferred to the opposite bed, but at the same time a new yarn is fed to the needle holding the split stitch and pulled through the transferred stitch. By doing so, a much smaller hole is created in the fabric as compared to just a transfer stitch. Open effects in the fabric can be created by a technique known as the drop stitch. This effect is created by a knitting needle holding a loop and going through the knitting cycle and not receiving a new yarn. Therefore, the stitch is dropped.